You're ready to start anytime, okay? Welcome.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I have to say that I've done a lot of teaching and presentations around the topic of intimacy and dementia. It has felt a little funny in the current pandemic situation to be talking about the idea of this, physical intimacy and closeness. But I think if we've learned nothing over the past few months, we have indeed learned that isolation is not necessarily good for us. And so I almost feel like the argument that I've tried to, the position I've taken for many years around how I feel we need to advocate for this particular topic it's almost been supported by the pandemic. I could talk about this all day. We have less than an hour. So I am going to move reasonably quickly through the slides that I've put together. There will be an opportunity at the end for questions. There's a team in the background who will be gathering questions that you will generate through the chat box. And I'm hoping that there will be an opportunity in the last 10 or 15 minutes for you to have those questions read out loud, and we can have a bit of somewhat interactive conversation back and forth. If there are absolutely no questions or no examples that people are looking for support with, I have a few examples that I'm quite happy to share. The objectives from my perspective out of today are that everyone who's attending gets a chance to really consider the myths and realities around sexuality and aging. And that means examining our own thoughts about it. As open-minded and free-thinking as many of us say we are, I still find at some point people hit a wall around this topic. And I think it's really important that the second objective comes forward, that we're able to manage it. It is a sensitive issue. We need to be comfortable addressing this particular topic. And when we start to deal with challenges, responsive behaviors associated with dementia that have a sexual element to them, I think it's important to understand that there are strategies that can be applied. It is not a recipe, but indeed, the more tools you have in your toolkit, the better prepared you are to perhaps help somebody and continue to support meaningful relationships, because that is the platform that I must stand on, is that meaningful relationships are important throughout life, and we need to be able to try and support that. So starting with myths and realities, as much as I would like to say that things have changed, it hasn't really. Society still seems to feel that sex is for the young. If you're old, it's not physiologically possible. Even older adults themselves start to believe that, and it can become what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. And for sure, institutionalization is presented as a myth. It's not really a myth. It can really mean the end of sexual freedom. And so I think that it's important that we always have that in the background as we talk about this. My soapbox for today: whether we like it or not, we have to challenge our own values and beliefs, because how I feel about a particular situation will influence how I react in that situation. And I think it's important to really internalize that, because it does also mean that if we're going to respect our colleagues, our coworkers, other family members, we have to understand that everyone might be coming at a particularly sensitive issue around sexual behavior from a different frame of reference, and we are all entitled to our own opinion. I may not ever know what in your life has led you to the particular point you are at now, what your values and beliefs are around a particular point, but I have to respect that you have an opinion and you're entitled to that opinion. I say this because at some point, discussions of intimacy are going to make most of us uncomfortable. Like I said, you hit that wall and you reach a point where now something is too icky or too disgusting to talk about. But we must talk about it. It is vital that we talk about it. And that's why I think that the opportunity for everyone to be able to participate in a webinar like today's is so valuable. because it gets us thinking and it gets us talking, sharing strategies, being comfortable talking about something that happened that made you uncomfortable. I've spent a lot of time working with staff who are care providers, and the number of times that once they feel that they're in a safe space and they can start to talk about a situation that made them uncomfortable when it was related to sexual behavior, they feel guilty, they feel they did something wrong, they feel that they caused something to happen, and we have to talk about it. So kudos to the Dementia Society for scheduling this opportunity to talk today. And I could talk about it all day, like I said, so I'm really happy to be here. The whole idea of talking raises the point that language is very crucial in a situation like this. You know, what does intimacy mean? What does sexuality mean? Do we think that if we're talking about sexual behavior that we're talking about intercourse? Is there anything before intercourse? And is that okay in an institutional setting, for example, or in a setting where someone has cognitive impairment? Constantly people are challenged by the issue of capacity and whether the person can actually consent to this behavior. And I think that the language can often get in the way of us being open and having the conversation that, as I've said, is so important. As soon as someone is labeled as sexually inappropriate or having sexual behaviors, that label follows them and people immediately judge and go into situations expecting the worst in many cases. And I really think that we have to get away from that and try and change that approach. But again, how do we know where everyone is coming from when a particular incident happens? I share a couple of examples of quotations and things that I've been told throughout the years that I've been exploring this topic. Dimitri Revelak is a psychologist who used to work at Baycrest, and he and I were both presenters of a panel many years ago. And we were talking about sexuality per se, meaning more than just intercourse, but also closeness, warmth, tenderness, companionship. And he actually said, and I've quoted him, if physical intimacy has been an important part of self-image and coping, it remains so. And I love that because I think for many of us, when we're struggling with behaviors that might be associated with dementia, we're taught that we have to learn about the person and we have to understand the person because that behavior means something. And if we understand what the behavior means, we're better able to understand the behavior and perhaps manage it. And I use air quotes around manage. Sexuality is no different. If physical intimacy has been important to me, if how I view myself as a human being, as a sexual being is important to me, then that's not going away, even in the profoundest stages of dementia. And I think it's very important that we remember that. I gave a talk to a large group of older adults a number of years ago. I had started off by developing an education component for colleagues who worked in an acute care hospital. And I had then been invited to speak to a group of older adults. And I decided to give them the opportunity to hear the kind of education that was being offered to staff, to see whether they felt it was on the mark, was I out of line? And I was very impressed with the feedback. People were calling me and sending me emails weeks later, giving me other thoughts that they had. And I give you just a couple of quotes that were shared by people who participated in that session, because again, it just reinforces to me how very meaningful this can be to older adults. And therefore the idea that we can help facilitate it and promote this for quality of life for the people that we care about and care for is so, so important. Things like sexuality is an important aspect of seniors' lives. Sexuality is more than the physical act. It encompasses all of who we are. These are such important statements to come from seniors themselves, to remind us about how important it is that we don't put it aside, that we don't shun it when it comes up. Now, I know that that's not always easy to address. And again, I've said one of the things that I hope we achieve out of this time together is a certain degree of comfort as we talk about this and explore this. Too many times throughout my career in healthcare have I had to deal with the giggling and the little chitter chatter from staff who have been confronted with a demonstration of sexual behavior that has made them uncomfortable. They have not known how to respond. And it's the giggling and the sniggering behind the person's back that seems to be their only way to address it. And we have to stop that, because it says much about how little we understand the importance of this issue. Alex Comfort back in 1972 said, "The things that stop you having sex with age are exactly the same as those that stop you riding a bicycle. Bad health, thinking it looks silly, or no bicycle." I love that quote. And I share that again. You'll see that most of what I'm talking about right now isn't so much about dementia. It's the fundamentals of sexuality as an important part of who we are. I start with that because I think we cannot lose sight of the fact that just because someone has started to decline cognitively doesn't mean that who they used to be is no longer important. And we know that at an intellectual level when we have to understand different kinds of behavior. You know, someone is screaming, someone is physically pushing us away. We've learned that we need to understand why they're doing that in order to help them. But a sexual behavior, for some reason, we're not prepared to take the same approach because it makes us uncomfortable, because we have not examined our own thoughts and our feelings. We need to get past that. So how do we do that? Well, one way we can do it is to try and have models, strategies, templates that can help us. And there is indeed one model. It's the PLISSIT model. The PLISSIT model is a model that was actually developed. It came out of sexual therapy work, and it's quite a simple model. The slide has a link at the bottom. That YouTube video is quite short, and it's just a really quick snapshot of what we mean by the PLISSIT model and how it applies. And PLISSIT stands for P for permission giving, LI for limited information, SS for specific suggestions, and IT for intensive therapy. And it's actually designed, as you can see, as an inverted triangle. I think one of the reasons that many people don't like to start to explore sexuality, sexual behavior, and tackle it at all is because many of us fear that we are going to end up down in the intensive therapy box and have to do in-depth sexual counseling with someone. And I am here to tell you that that is not usually the case. And for me, what I've learned in my years of working with older adults and their care providers is that the bulk of the time, it's about permission. And I like the PLISSIT model because you see that the largest chunk of the model starts at the top with permission. Permission giving is the most important phase. And I think most of us, if we think about our work, our support for older adults, for example, let me use myself. I'm an occupational therapist. Occupational therapists are trained to do in-depth assessments of a range of what we call ADLs, activities of daily living. And that includes things like dressing, grooming, toileting. Indeed, we ask detailed questions about people's personal hygiene. There should be an element of exploring someone's sexuality in that initial assessment. But over the years, I've learned that we tend to avoid that. And yet we do explore other in-depth issues. And so the permission giving is opening the door, if you like, to a conversation. Let me give you an example. An occupational therapist, I'm doing a home visit with someone who was in hospital and suffered, let's say, a hip fracture, has certain difficulties with certain movements. They're now ready to be discharged. And back in the day, I've been practicing for a number of years, back in the day, often the acute care occupational therapist could see the person in their own home prior to discharge. Now we would connect with a community occupational therapist. So I would say that it's now going to be the job of the community occupational therapist to have the kind of conversation that I was having. And so part of my job naturally was in the home to see how this person manages to get around. They had a hip fracture, so getting up out of a chair, their favorite chair, are they able to get in and out of it? Can they get on and off the toilet? There's that toileting again. How about getting in and out of bed? I can still recall a home visit with an older woman, and when we were in the bedroom, there were 2 beds, not together, 2 separate beds. And I had to ask her which one was hers because I needed to see her get on and off that bed. Then I asked about the other bed, and this is really me going off on a bit of a tangent, but helping to illustrate how very important and actually very simple this permission giving stage can be. I needed to make sure that this was the only bed she was going to get on and off of, and I asked her about the other bed, and she kind of just scoffed and said that that was her husband's bed. And so I asked her if she would ever be getting in and out of that bed. And she giggled a bit, and then she actually settled down and she said, no, they had not slept together for quite a long time now. And I just asked if she was okay with that. One question, are you okay with that? That conversation did kind of open up the floodgates, but it was the permission giving, because I was giving her permission to share something a bit more intimate about her relationship with her husband. Turns out, and I don't think this is that unusual, I think many of us probably encounter situations like this, she was having real issues with incontinence, and so she was embarrassed and had started sleeping in a separate bed. If I apply the Plicit model, if I think back, at the time I did not know I was applying Plicit, but I use this example now because Plicit applied to how I handled that discussion. The bulk of my interaction was in giving her permission to talk about the situation. In fact, she wasn't happy about no longer having that physical closeness with her husband, but she was too embarrassed to talk about it. And so then we moved from permission to limited information. I talked a little bit about the incontinence, learned a little bit about what was happening. I wasn't about to diagnose something, but I talked to her about some of the kind of strategies that most of us are aware of, especially when working with older adults. You know, did they tend to have that nighttime cup of tea before bed? And what time was she having that tea? And how easy was it for her to get up and get to the bathroom? And was that maybe why she was starting to be incontinent at night? Just restricting her fluid intake late at night was a specific suggestion that I was able to make that she seemed to think might be something she would take seriously. No intensive therapy, no sex therapy needed. It was a simple conversation that started with me just asking the question, are you okay with that? And I think it is so important that we remember that. We're not asking everyone to be a sex therapist. We're asking everyone to respect the person's need for a meaningful relationship. Not having necessarily to think about all of you in a situation of being in the home. There are many different ways that you might want to open up the conversation, open the door to a discussion at that permission level. I often share with colleagues, with teammates, questions like, a simple question like, what changes in physical intimacy have you experienced as you've grown older? There are indeed physiological changes that happen to older adults. And I think it's important that we explore that with them because I'll be honest, 30 years ago when I started giving these talks, if I went and Googled sexuality, I got a lot of porn sites. And then things started to change. And now if you start Googling sex and sexuality, you'll get a lot of Viagra commercials. There's far more now about gender issues. Things have indeed changed, but we're still so uncomfortable having those conversations. So think about one or two kind of questions that you might ask. If you are indeed getting to know someone, working with them, and want to learn as much about the person as possible. And you might be talking to a family member who is the spouse of someone who's coming into your program, for example. There are things we're going to need to know. I often talk to couples about, you know, what goals do you have for your intimate relationship? If you're in a relationship, do you still want to be in a relationship? And if they're not in a relationship, are they likely to want to seek out a relationship? Are you admitting someone to a nursing home? Do you know what kind of sleeping arrangements the new resident had? We take people who've been sleeping in a double or a queen or a king size bed beside the same warm, snoring, farting, burping body for 50, 60 years. We plunk them into long-term care and stick them in a small bed by themselves. Is it any wonder they start looking for companionship? I think we have to think a little bit harder about how we're getting to know this individual. Can you have a conversation with family members about what mom or dad used to be like, or grandma or grandpa? You need to know if mom was a bit of a flirt, or if dad's always been a ladies' man, because those kinds of words have very important meanings that might help us understand behaviors that we now might start seeing in people. Those are the kinds of questions I think are important for us to start getting comfortable asking. If you're going to get comfortable, it means you have to understand and examine your own issues. I always encourage involving family members in these discussions when you can, when they're open to being involved in the discussions. I highlight, though, that it's to involve them as partners in the conversation, not for approval. I've presented often with a couple of different lawyers from the Advocacy Center for the Elderly, and they are always very clear about the fact that you do not suddenly go to a substitute decision maker for approval for sex. And bad news for some people out there, just because you write into your advanced care planning directive that you want to be able to have sex freely when you get incapacitated, doesn't guarantee it will be respected. But at least let's start talking about it. And that means family members have to start talking with each other about it. And that means that mom and dad are going to have some conversations with the kids. And we all know that those conversations might not be easy conversations, but we've got to talk about it, because we also have to be able to examine the behaviors. Now let's talk about dementia. Let's talk about someone who does indeed have cognitive impairment, severe enough that we're seeing responsive behaviors, and what are we going to do about it? Well, we need to be systematic about this. Even more important that we are systematic in our approach when the behavior is of a sexual nature, because the emotions and the feelings that bubble up when we are confronted with something of a sexual nature can really get in the way of us being able to be objective about it. So I stress that you need to be systematic. This slide is just a kind of a bit of a framework that I've always used to guide me. It builds on all the other frameworks that are out there. There are a lot of different frameworks. I'm not saying that that one is better than another. I'm saying have something that will help you be objective. And at the top, and absolutely, when it's something of a sexual nature, we've got to stop. You've got to take a breath, stop, and think, what is this particular behavior that I'm seeing? Can I be objective about it? And that will be when you're going to use your tracking tools, your DOS, whatever your program or your facility or your organization is using to chart behavior, to track behavior. Even if it's just what we call Q15 monitoring, the checklist of, what are they doing every 15 minutes? Cohen-Mansfield's agitation inventory. There are lots of different tools out there. The tools might not be the most instructive, but it helps us be objective. When something is making us uncomfortable, and if I'm going into a nursing home, for example, and asked to help staff who are dealing with a particular issue, and it's an issue of a sexual nature, one of the questions that you would ask is, well, when does it happen? They're going to say all the time. It just makes me so uncomfortable. Well, it's not happening all the time. But because they have an emotional investment in it and it's making them uncomfortable, it feels like it happens all the time. And I understand that. Can we be objective and really see if there's a pattern, if there are triggers? And on the other side, there's the examination of your feelings and your responses to the behavior. This is not easy, but this is where you can gather a lot of support. Give people that you're working with a safe environment, a safe space to really talk about how they feel about this. If someone in their heart believes that homosexuality is a sin, then guess what? Being asked to support two individuals of the same gender who are demonstrating affection for each other is not going to be easy. We have to be able to explore that. The middle chunk of the slide is really the standard approach to any responsive behavior. We need to know what's going on with the person, physically, psychologically, cognitively, and then what might be going on around the person. If the environment, the physical, social, environmental issues. And the reason that I like to stress this is because each one of these categories, if you bring a group of people together, again, I go back into the example that I've shared. I'm in a nursing home and being asked to, address a particular issue. One of the first things I want to do is get as much information as I can. I pull the people together who are working with this individual, who can give me that. If you have 4 people in a group talking about a particular behavior, you could get 4 different ideas about what they believe is the cause. That's fine. That leads you to 4 different things you might try in an attempt to understand this behavior. Then you move to the bottom of the slide and you see that then you must try something. So we figured out that maybe it's a physical issue. We're going to treat that physical problem. Got to monitor and see, did it work or not? You're going to have 2 outcomes. Either the behavior improves or it doesn't. If it improves, great. Get that documented, get that communicated. Everyone needs to know this is what works. Don't feel that you've failed and don't promote a sense of failure, because many times staff won't want to say that something was tried and it didn't work. But what doesn't work is also important information. So get them to share that information. And then we reassess. We go back up to the top. Okay, we tried this, it didn't work. What about something else? Is there something else going on? Here's an example. Mr. Smith, gentleman in a resident lounge. Let's say it's a retirement home situation. He's in the lounge, he sits in the corner by himself. Others in the room are involved in a card game. Suddenly, Mr. Smith begins to masturbate. The other residents notice this and become upset. That is not that unusual an example. I'm sure many of you can relate to that. And you can take it out of the retirement home setting and put it in a different kind of setting. But I give you this because this is one of many examples that I've had to deal with over time. And so underneath, these are some standard questions. Always I come at these issues and challenges and behaviors that are raised with me with, what are your thoughts about this? And I'm asking all of you out there right now, what do you think about this? How would you handle it? And maybe in your head, you can think of one thing, but in your heart, you can think of something else. In other words, sometimes we know what we should do, but it's not what we do. How would you feel in this situation? How would you feel if you were the staff person that walked into this lounge? How would you feel if you were, I don't know, Mr. Smith's daughter and got a call from the social worker? How would you feel if you were a family member of one of the other residents in the room when this happened? These are the sorts of questions that make this such a tricky, such a messy topic. Sexual behavior is not easy, and everyone would agree with that. But it doesn't mean that we can't tackle it. Something like this, with the same framework, the same kind of structured approach. Are there physical issues that might be contributing? Are there psychological issues that might be contributing? Cognitive issues, environmental issues. And each one of those components could be a major contributing factor. And so this is where being systematic and objective can be so important. We've said possibly it's physical discomfort. Possibly it's a psychological issue. Maybe it's cognitive, maybe it's environmental. So physical, is Mr. Smith itchy? And in fact, he wasn't really masturbating, he was just scratching himself. You'd be amazed how many times as soon as someone reaches down into their private area, they're immediately labeled as dirty and told that it's bad and told to stop that. We got to get away from that and start looking at this as a behavior like any other behavior. Why are they doing it? Because if it is that he's itchy, maybe he needs that to be handled. Maybe he just needs a little bit of, like, I don't know, cornstarch. What do you use when you're itchy down there? Or is there something more serious going on? Psychological. Remember I said, was Mr. Smith always a bit of a ladies' man? And are those ladies over there in the corner playing cards? And does he fancy one of them? Do we understand that that might be contributing to it? Would Mr. Smith, under normal circumstances, never have dreamed of exposing himself in public? But now he's kind of lost that ability to understand what's socially appropriate because of his cognitive decline. And do we understand the cognitive issues? Because sometimes the cognitive problems get in the way of how the person understands what we tell them then. We have to be clear. We're very simple about some of the other instructions we give people when we know that they have profound cognitive impairment. Can we keep the message simple in this case? Can we be non-judgmental? None of this, it's dirty, it's bad. But we do that. And maybe that's absolutely the wrong way to go. As much as possible, the caregiving is key. And whether you like it or not, caregivers need to all be involved in what's happening, what approach is going to be taken, and consistency is very important. Because if one of us giggles and then goes away, and if the next person sees him and smacks his hand, and the next person just quietly takes him out of the resident lounge and puts him in his own room and lets him finish, how is Mr. Smith supposed to know what the right thing is to do? Because 3 different people have reinforced his behavior 3 different ways. Again, intellectually, we know how this should be handled, but because it's intimacy, because it's sex, we can't seem to be as objective about it, but we must be. I have a number of case examples that I could share with you guys. I don't know if people, as I'm starting to give you these examples and give you the framework, if you're having questions in your own mind. So I've put this slide up just to let you know that if you do have questions, you can certainly be sending them in. I have a few more sort of like, yeah, yes, but slides, because I can hear many of you going, yeah, well, that's all well and good, but what about? And so I do want to have a little bit of the yes, but conversation, and then I'm going to stop talking. And indeed, if you do have some examples, we can try and see if they can be shared. If you don't have any examples, what I'm going to do is give you some more of my own case examples, because I always have lots of them. But let's get on to the, well, that's all well and good, Sylvia, but what about risk? I would never intend for you to think that I don't believe that there are risks involved. Of course there are. And I think many times that is what compounds our emotional feelings when it comes to something of a sexual nature, because we don't want people to get hurt. And when there's cognitive issues, we're very concerned about how vulnerable the individual is and how much they might need protecting. And so I think there always has to be an element of examining of the risk. This can be a difficult conversation, but can also be quite enlightening, because I do find sometimes that it can be helpful for people to be asked to kind of explore risk versus benefit together, because that is what you need to do. I mean, I gave you 3 examples for Mr. Smith. Tell him what he's doing is wrong, take him out of the room, or in one case, when it used to happen repeatedly in the dining room, I had one personal support worker who would just take one of the bibs that they put around the person during mealtime and just put it on his lap. Because he would yell and scream and get extremely agitated if they tried to physically remove him from the dining room when he was demonstrating this behavior. And so they had to really look at how disruptive is it to try and physically remove him versus, you know, turn him so he's oriented such that most of the other people cannot see, and then cover his lap so that it isn't obvious what he's doing. Those kind of risk-benefit discussions are important. They're not easy, but you have to explore them, because if we are going to evaluate the degree of risk, I mean, are we really going to say that what I believe is an important value is more important? If masturbation is a sin, for example, if that's what I believe, Is that belief of mine more important than your belief? And you might believe that it's something healthy and he's just lost the ability to know where he can do it in a safe environment. These are the kinds of discussions we have to have. And what does everyone else think about it? I will tell you, what if the person has found that masturbation is the only way that they can manage chronic pain? Did you know that some people find that masturbation is the only way to manage chronic pain? And now you're going to tell me that masturbation is a sin? I am not trying to be flippant. I am just trying to share how very complicated this is. And you have to be prepared for these complicated issues to bubble up to the surface if you're going to get people talking about it. At an organizational level, oh boy, it's challenging. And I'm always asking, do we have a policy? For example, are you in a long-term care home and is there a policy around residents' rights? Yes. Sexuality, intimacy? Possibly not. But I wonder if there should be. And I will tell you that it comes back to what I said, many minutes ago about language, because if you're going to have a policy, it's going to have a name. And right off the bat, you're going to have to talk about what are we talking about sexual behavior? What do we mean? Are we talking about intimacy? What do we mean? Having a policy, although many management people are not that keen, it can go a long way to helping staff feel supported. When someone is joining this organization, part of their orientation includes understanding that these are things that we are here to support for our residents. And you educate staff around what that means. But what else do we need? We probably need people who are comfortable talking about it, who can champion it. I'm not saying that it's like you have a code white team and you have a sex code team, but you need to try and build the capacity of people who do instinctively understand it's important, and maybe in spite of what they believe is okay or appropriate, understand that it's part of their job to make this a good environment and try and contribute to somebody's quality of life. The issue of capacity and consent is so thorny, but you need to pull people in. You need to have ethics support for something like this. What else do you need? You might need to know that you have maybe somebody has the Advocacy Center for the Elderly on speed dial, because you need to call and get some advice. Now, they are very clear that they are there to support the older adult themselves, but they will problem solve hypothetical situations with you, and they will tell you clearly where the law can step in and assist you if you are in a situation where you believe the risk is great to this individual, the risk of harm to that person or the harm to others. I'm never intending that you think that there is no harm. There's always risk. But I think that we need to talk about it. The worst case scenario is where there are legal implications and where we need to call the police because of harm, the risk of harm. But before we get to that end, what kind of a climate and culture have we created? What kind of an environment do we work in? And are people allowed to talk about it? Because I think if we could talk about it, if we could understand this aspect of the people we care about, and maybe be a little bit more comfortable in examining the issue, it might help us and maybe sometimes mitigate the risk of getting down the road to that horrible outcome at the far end that I think many people always have in the back of their minds. And many times when there's a problem, you can start by saying, who is this a problem for? Because a lot of times the problem is not with the residents, and sometimes it's not even with the families. It's with that particular staff member who simply says, I know what they are doing in that room behind the closed door, and that it has to stop. And that's when I think you need to really then examine, where is this behavior coming from? Is this really a problem of the resident, of the older adults? Or is it a problem of a particular staff member? And is it that person's values and beliefs that are limiting the ability to care for this client, patient, resident in the best possible manner? These are the sorts of things that I think cannot be swept under the rug. It is so, so important that we always have these things in our mind, that we try and not be judgmental, not of the person who's demonstrating the behavior, but not of our colleagues either. because all that does is divides us, and we're not, and then we're not there doing what we need to be doing, which is creating the best possible environment for the people we care about. So I think I should stop talking. I'm watching the time, and I did promise 10 to 15 minutes of questions. I wonder if, as I've been talking, if some questions have come in, and if so, I can stop talking. And again, if not, then I have some case examples that I would happily share.
All right. So thank you, Sylvia, for this great presentation. This is a real hot topic. And does anyone has a question for Sylvia today or any comment? Please, you can type it in the chat box or the Q&A questions. So maybe we can just read the ones that we have.
I hope they're not too hard.
Any question? Any comment?
Hi. So we don't have any questions so far, but we do have a comment that says, Sylvia, your presentation is fantastic, frank, and so incredibly needed. So that was quite wonderful, but no questions yet.
So then why don't I give a couple more examples? Like I said, I find sometimes the examples can in themselves raise more questions and might trigger some extra discussion. Let me give you an example of a gentleman with frontotemporal dementia. So, you know, a lot of disinhibition because of where the brain damage is. He's living in a nursing home and is regularly visited by a volunteer, Jenny. She comes in as part of the friendly visiting program. Jenny's lovely. She's young, she's a bright spark, and people are always happy to see her. And then one day she comes to the nursing station and says that she can no longer come back to the facility because Mr. Langley has repeatedly asked her if she wanted to go to bed with him. And on the last visit, he tried to grab her breasts and she walks out. So, so there's a situation. And again, if you think about, you know, the systematic approach, when I was asked to handle this, of course, you know, what are your thoughts? The staff who approached me were completely divided. Some of them felt horrible for Jenny, and some of them believed that Jenny must have done something. And I thought, you know, I wondered if some of that had been shared with Jenny herself. I mean, Jenny herself felt horrible. I knew Jenny, she was lovely. Part of my examination of the issue, I needed to learn more about this particular resident. And Mr. Langley he was actually quite a jolly guy, and people liked him as well. People were actually very puzzled by this. Now, don't get offended, people, but let me describe the scenario for you. So Jenny is, she's quite full-figured, and in the summer, you know, never dressed immodestly, but would indeed come in to visit him, you know, in, you know, a t-shirt, an open blouse, and on several occasions had been observed like reaching over to help Mr. Langley get something. And I think without really being aware of her position around him, had kind of been like opening up her chest right at his eye level. And Mr. Langley thought Jenny was lovely, and because of his frontotemporal dementia, had lost the ability to understand that trying to grab those breasts that were now dangling in front of him was wrong. He simply had lost the ability to control that behavior. I shared Jenny's example because it seemed a little bit random, but in fact, I've had similar situations. I've had staff very, very distressed at having a gentleman that they had cared for a long time, who again was considered a great guy by the staff, start grabbing at the staff, at their breasts, at their butts. And most of the distress of the staff was because they'd been caring for him for a long time, and you know, he'd been in the home for a very long time. He was declining cognitively over time. He also declined physically. And he was now at a stage where he was in a wheelchair and required 2 people for a transfer. And when I asked to observe them transferring him, because part of my objective examination of the problem, remember, like, try and get some objective ideas of when this happens, it often happened when they were getting him up and out of his chair or putting him in his chair. And so I observed them transfer him. And 2 caregivers, very, very good caregivers, one on each side of him, reaching down to get him up out of the chair with their chests right here in front of his face. And this gentleman had reached a point in his degree of cognitive decline where all he saw was these great girls with their breasts right in front of him, and he started acting inappropriately. When I shared that what I had objectively seen with them, the staff were, well, first they were horrified, and then they kind of stepped back and thought about it and totally understood what was going on. And I share that example with all of you because it kind of helped them stop being frustrated and disappointed and feeling hurt, because they did indeed appreciate that he couldn't control the behavior, and that in a way, what they'd been doing inadvertently was prompting the behavior, but it wasn't anything that they'd done wrong. I think that often, and in the case of Jenny, the volunteer, she was quite sure that you know, she had precipitated the problem. I've had staff who feel they're doing something wrong when they're giving pericare and a gentleman gets an erection. But that's a physiological response to being touched down there. It's not your fault. And I think those are the important things that we need to talk about, because people, if they think they've done something wrong, how can they comfortably share? Give you another example. I'm at a nursing station. And again, a lot of this is institutional examples right now, but you can extrapolate to your own life circumstances. I'm going in because I'm going to do some education, not about sex. I don't know, something else entirely. I don't know, WMIS or fire alerts. I don't know. I'm at the nursing station in the corner getting ready. There are staff sitting at the nursing station, and a gentleman comes up to the nursing station. And he comes up and he goes right up to a nurse who's sitting right in front of him, and he goes, I need to see the doctor. Can I see the doctor, please? Can I see the doctor? When can I see the doctor? Can I see the doctor? When can I see the doctor? I need to see the doctor. I can tell. I mean, I'm over here in the corner minding my own business, but I'm pretty sure he's done this before, because nobody pays any attention to him. Everybody just keeps on doing what they're doing. Now, in fairness, it's getting close to end of shift. People had stuff they had to get wrapped up so they could get out. He goes on like this for another minute, seemed like an eternity, but it wasn't. And can I see the doctor? When can I see the doctor? I need to see the doctor. You want to have sex? Let's have sex. As soon as he said that, guess what happened? The nurse that he was standing right in front of put down her pen and looked at him and said, John, you know you're not supposed to talk like that. Now go back to your room. And I think to myself, if you think about the environmental situation around someone, whether we like it or not, we have inadvertently reinforced his behavior, the unwanted behavior, because what we taught him was that unless you say something about sex, we're going to ignore you. Now, she was not pleasant to him. She was very strict with him. But I think for some of our clients, for our residents, for our older adults, even negative attention is better than being ignored. And that was the only way he could get any attention. We reinforced his bad behavior. I think we need to ask ourselves about that. I'm going to take a pause just in case anything else has come in. Otherwise, I can give you more examples because I got lots of them.
No questions yet.
No, okay, all right. So next example, Mr. Brown. Actually, I wonder, should we have a lady? Yes, here's one, Mrs. Purple. Mrs. Purple is a resident with severe dementia in your nursing home. Mr. Purple visits his wife regularly and frequently asks for privacy when he visits. Staff have accidentally entered Mrs. Purple's room when Mr. Purple is visiting and have found them both engaged in sexual intercourse. So I stopped there and I asked the question, what are your thoughts? Is this okay? And, you know, in a group discussion, you would have different responses to that question, because some would say it's disgusting, but most would understand that they're married, they're husband and wife, and this is her home now. And so, yes, of course it's okay. Then, now, let me add a layer on to that. You've noticed they're engaged in sexual intercourse. However, one of the staff says that Mrs. Purple has appeared to be resisting. So now I ask the question again, what are your thoughts? And is this okay? And this is where we start to get into the murky waters around consent. So this is a real example. I've also been in situations where staff have supported an individual, a woman who would go out. Her husband was still well and in the community, and he would take her home on weekends. And over time, some staff started to feel that there was something wrong about the weekend visits because of the behavior that the wife would exhibit and demonstrate on her return from the weekend visit initially, and then even when the husband was coming to pick her up. And they suspected that there might be an element of abuse going on. And when these issues come up, we absolutely have to step in. Then it doesn't matter how open-minded and free-thinking we might be, and you have to ask yourself, is it okay just because they're married that she seems to be resisting? Many times I'm challenged by people, well, they're not competent, so how on earth can we possibly allow this to happen? How do we know if they're okay with this behavior? And I often then ask people to step back and think, okay, well, how else do they show you when they don't want to do something? In a nursing home setting, you know, how loudly do they yell and how much do they physically resist when you try and drag them down the hall for a shower when they don't want to go? Many times we know when they don't want to do something. They demonstrate in other ways. They may not say, no, I don't want to do that, but they show us in other ways what they want to do and what they don't want to do. And if we understand the person, we get to see their behavior. Sometimes it's something more nonverbal, you know, it's a look on their face or the way they act. Many staff, good caregivers understand those nuances of the people they care for. And they indeed can say, she's not okay with this. I'm going to leave it and come back later. Whatever this is. Could be trying to get them to eat something. Could be trying to get them up and washed and dressed, and they're just not ready. The same kinds of behaviors can be observed if someone is getting too close, if someone is being forced into an intimate act that they don't want to participate in. And those are the kinds of behaviors that we must pick up on, because then, never mind meaningful relationships, never mind quality of life, we do have a responsibility to protect this person. I think that it's vital that we, again, are able to talk about this. I gave a talk to a group of community people and staff from a chapter of the Alzheimer's Society a number of years ago. And there was a woman who attended who came up afterwards and identified herself as a volunteer with that chapter of the Alzheimer's Society. And she told me that she had cared for her husband at home for a number of years until the point where, because of his dementia, she could no longer care for him safely. And he moved into a nursing home. And he died about a year later. And then she became a volunteer. She had been supported by this chapter of the Alzheimer's Society throughout her husband's illness, and then, you know, joined them as a volunteer after he died. And then she started to cry. And she told me that during the last year, or maybe more, that she was at home with him, that he would become very sexually aggressive with her and demand sex at all hours of the day and night. She never told anyone. She hated it because she didn't feel that he really knew who she was anymore, but she was his wife, and so she felt it was her duty. And I shared that. I asked her if I could use, without revealing details, you know, the flavor of the story in future teaching, because she and I spent a lot of time talking about how, with all of the supports that she had in place throughout the trajectory of her husband's illness, Nobody ever opened the door. If we go back to the permission model, no one opened the door to the conversation. She never told anyone. She was embarrassed. She was uncomfortable, and she never felt that she could raise it with anybody. And I share that with you now because it reinforces the message. We need to give people the opportunity. Just because you open the door to the discussion doesn't mean they have to go there. You can ask someone, are you okay sleeping in separate beds? And they'll go, oh yeah, fine, thanks. He was a burping, farting, snoring old man, and I'm much better off in my own bed. Great, end of conversation. But at least they know that in another situation, maybe they could talk about it. Again, it's so important that we talk about it. I'm not sure of timing, but I think we might be out of time. So I think I really need to stop talking now.
Well, we do have one last comment. One of the participants says, in terms of the consent that we were talking about, right, just because I can't count backwards by 7 doesn't mean I don't have the capacity to understand intimacy.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Thank you. Yes, we do mini mentals all the time. Everybody go home and practice counting backwards or spelling hotel backwards. But absolutely, I might not be able to do that, but I'm still a real person. That's great.
All right.
I guess, sorry, I just want to say
Sylvia,
thank you to everybody for letting me do this.
thank you, Sylvia, for this great examples. I think it's very useful. I think a lot of people will watch this video later on as well. So just don't worry if you miss it or you want to watch it again. This video, it's going to be available right away on Facebook on Facebook page, and it's going to be also available on our YouTube channel on demand. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Herman Chica Alfonso. I'm the Education and Program Coordinator for the Dementia Society of Ottawa and Renfrew County. I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you, Sylvia, for this information.
Excellent. And the very first slide has my email. If anybody wants to reach out, don't hesitate. But also get in touch with the Dementia Society. They have so many resources to help you.
All right, so thank you everyone for tuning in. For more information on upcoming webinars and programs, visit our website, dementiahelp.ca, or register to our weekly roundup. And have a nice day, everyone.